Thank you so much for coming this evening. And welcome to the PA Speaker Series. I'm Jenny Stone, last year's Parents Association President. And tonight's speaker, Cristina Dolan, class of '79, is going to take us into the fascinating and rapidly evolving world of artificial intelligence and help us understand its current and far-reaching impacts. Cristina Dolan is an award-winning cybersecurity executive, engineer, computer scientist, and entrepreneur, driving transformation in security, data, fintech, and telecom. She co-founded a groundbreaking cybersecurity startup and has served as an advisor to cybersecurity companies. Currently, she serves on the boards of 3 public companies: WiseKey, SealSQ, and Grit. Most recently, she was the RSA NetWitness LATAM Managing Director and headed the Americas Channel and Global Alliances. In addition to holding executive positions at Disney, IBM, and Oracle, Cristina co-founded OneMain.com, which grew to become the 10th largest ISP after a successful IPO that surpassed Amazon's and eBay's respective IPO records. Her accolades include co-authoring Transparency in ESG and launching the renowned Dream It, Code It, Win It student coding competition, which garnered numerous honors. Recognized as the coup de coeur of the CEFCYs in Europe, alongside distinctions such as 100 Women in Finance, Cristina exemplifies visionary leadership. She holds a master's degree from the MIT Media Lab and earned both a Master of Computer Science Engineering and a Bachelor of Electrical Engineering, and is an esteemed alumna of Sacred Heart Greenwich. She is a keynote speaker and an award-winning author of 2 books, Transparency in ESG and the Circular Economy, Capturing Opportunities Through Data, and Industry 5.0 in the Data Economy. She has spent much of January in Davos and is the very forefront of how rapidly advancing technology is intersecting with business, education, government, and society. Please join me in welcoming Cristina Dolan to the podium.
Can you hear me? Can everybody hear me? So let me, well, I guess we didn't move the slide over to my, God forbid, let me just get rid of that slide. Don't always like to be reminded of my age. But anyway, let me just get this slide over here so I can start talking. It's so funny, this morning I spoke to the students and I was graciously introduced and they went through like my whole bio and then they said, oh, and she was on the bobsled and skeleton team, and everybody was like, yay! And I was like, how about the rest of my bio? I think that's pretty good. But anyway, so thank you so much for coming, and I'm going to talk today about artificial intelligence and kind of the future of work. And because I've spent my entire career at this sort of, bleeding edge of technology where we're disrupting industries with all these new technologies, I have a completely different view than some of the politicians might have with respect to the future of AI and how it's going to ruin the world and how it must be stopped. So, because I think of artificial intelligence as sort of, like if you think about creativity as a painter, right? You have this palette and you have all these different paints with different textures. And so if you're going to create utilizing those tools, you have to know how to mix them together, how they work, their consistency, how to put them on a palette. And so when I think about artificial intelligence, I think about it as one of these pieces on this palette that you're going to be able to use to be able to solve interesting problems in the future. And so that's why I think it's really important to learn as much as possible about this and all these other tools, because our children are going to live in a world where everything is going to be constantly changing and they're going to have to learn on the go all the time. So with that, let's get started. Of course, let me see if I can...
It may not be on.
It may not be on? Okay. I'm sorry about that. Thanks. Simple diagnosis there. So what is artificial intelligence versus ChatGPT and generative AI? So how many people have a background or understanding? I know I spoke to a couple people that know a little bit about AI. How many people here have a good sense about AI and what it is? Okay, so I see some hands come up. I was CEO of an AI company, was spun out of MIT with Chomsky's students who knew a lot about computational linguistics about 20 years ago. And I remember the venture capitalists would say, oh, AI's been around for a long, long time, hasn't really done anything. And so the world that we live in now is a little bit different from what it was back then. I mean, obviously you know that it evolved from the 1970s because, as computers came out, we wanted to be able to talk with them and have them behave like humans and have human capabilities. And, that's been sort of a trend for a long time. But it wasn't until 2017 when this paper called Attention is All You Need came out, produced by these Google students, that all of a sudden things clicked and this whole generative, communicative agent technology evolved that all of a sudden made everybody wake up and say, wow, this is one of those paints on this paint set that I can use to do interesting things. So the world of old AI is very different. And just to accentuate, when I told you that I was CEO of a AI company, it was during that last blue bust over there, during that time, in which it wasn't so interesting. So it's obviously had its boom time and like less interesting time. But I want to make sure people understand when we talk about AI, it's a very broad field, right? So, these are over here on the left is things like big data. I mean, there's lots of different topics, so that cognitive computing, business intelligence, which has been around for decades. And then this black and gray area, that represents the generative AI, which is a completely different animal that sort of has evolved in the last couple of years. And then you have all the machine learning, which obviously is another part of it. So when we talk about AI, it's a very broad field. And artificial intelligence, I'm not going to spend too much time, it's been used for a long time, so everything from license plate readers to special effects, credit scoring. I mean, how many people get those alerts on their phone saying that there's a charge on your card? That's artificial intelligence, been around for a long time. So obviously artificial intelligence is something that has sort of been under the covers that people don't really think about until recently. And this is a slide from 2017. I'm not going to spend any time on it, but this is in 2017, around the time the generative AI started popping up. These were all the industries that were already using artificial intelligence. So, as I'm saying, it's not sort of a new thing. I used this slide this morning, but how many of your children actually play chess? Yes, of course. So obviously the game of chess has changed a lot because the use of these artificial intelligence assisted tools for learning and offering suggestions has completely changed the game. In the past they would get a certain number of moves that they would open with, but now it's like everything has exploded, the rules have all changed. It's completely changed how grandmasters play. I'm not going to get into the 2% that cheat with these tools. So if you're interested, I highly suggest that you go and look up this paper called Attention is All You Need, which is this paper that was done by these folks who worked at Google, their think tank, and they came up with this idea of this engine that would create these large language models. Because before this point in time, you had to teach the computer knowledge in order to get the artificial intelligence to be smart, right? But after this point, all of a sudden you had the ability to throw lots of compute power and lots of data in order to be able to get the computers to sort of learn things on their own. And this is sort of a line of demarcation that I'm hoping everybody understands. So in the past, you needed a person to classify the data. It would enter in the computer and it would say, this is a can, this is a glass. But now, in this generative space where you throw lots of data and it uses probability and a lot of math, and it figures out that it's a can, and the can has soda or a drink that you pour in the glass, these associations and information is extracted from the context. And that's what's made this kind of seem so magical. Once again, the domains all had to be separately trained. Now it's all done automatically. And obviously probability is the way it guesses, what then comes next. So if you're starting to tell a fairy tale, the guess would be from a probability. If you start at once upon a time, you start with once upon, it'll come up with and a time. I've oversimplified this in the worst way, so for those of you who know, and of course, obviously the math is really complex, and the reason why I have that three-dimensional, these vectors and the mathematics associated with the probability on these new models is really complex. You have complex data and mathematical relationships. You hear about parameters, tokens, vectors. I'm not going to get into it, but I'm just trying to give you a sense of this is the AI that everybody's talking about versus, your grandmother's AI or whoever's AI that was. I also want to point out, and this is an important slide because as we talk about careers, I don't want you to think that everything related to artificial intelligence has to do with creating those mathematical models and being a computer scientist and just, living in the bowels of that math. I think that this is probably one of the more interesting areas from a career perspective because a lot of the generative AI that's being used is being used as an agent, right? It means that you have humans that are using this agent technology with regular English language and saying, I would like to know, all of the, financial aspects of, how much candy we sell in the spring or something to that effect. And these agent technologies figure out where, they cross over into the infrastructure. They know where to get that information, and if they have permission to get that data, they're able to retrieve that and then assemble all that back into English language into a report or whatever it is that's needed. So I'm once again oversimplifying, but the whole art of figuring out from a business perspective what the problem is that needs to be solved, where that information is, who's supposed to be involved, that's an art form that people don't really think about today, right? So if you're going to use these systems, these are private, libraries, large, they might be small language models or large language models. They might be private data sets. So this has nothing to do with, the government officials worried about stealing the New York Times data to do OpenAI. This is a completely different animal, but obviously these are all sort of related. So it's important to realize that not all artificial intelligence is the same. And so here are some examples. I mean, I'll leave this deck behind, but you've got, how many people here use Duolingo? Well, yeah, so, and then Khan Academy is also using this kind of agent technology that you can ask it questions, it formulates it on your behalf, goes into the traditional system, gets the information, presents it back so that you can have a human dialogue with an existing system to make that experience better. So once again, I want you to think about what are the skill sets required to work, to engineer that human behavior and that new type of human interface that's very different from a graphical interface. Okay, so now, I know this is a really crowded slide, and I want to thank my friend Jillian for helping me orchestrate this, but when I think about the artificial intelligence ecosystem, it's not just about building these models. This is a list of all of the components of the ecosystem. So you have the hyperscalers, which are basically all the cloud companies that are making it possible to deploy these different systems. You have the chip providers, which is, of course, there's a big rush to go out and get these new GPU chips. It takes 2 years to, there's a backlog on them. You've got transformers, which are part of the architecture that I just showed you, which is, obviously, if you're going to do that, you're going to have to love math. You've got data providers. People are creating data sets to be able to train the private models. You've got private large language models. You've got small language models that are being trained for specific things by companies. Then you have RAG, which was that picture that I just showed you about the person who's doing these queries against an existing infrastructure. You've got private corporate AI agents. You've got, for example, you've got Microsoft that has, launched their Copilot, right? That's an AI agent that is basically set on rails that will get stuff from Salesforce and a variety of other systems that they've partnered with. You've got service providers, which are all the consulting companies. You've got the frameworks and libraries, the model marketplaces, like, I love the name of this one, Hugging Face, which is a very popular one. And you've got integration platforms, AI startups, cybersecurity. This is all data, right? So now you have to protect the data because you're accessing data automatically through agents, right? And then you're going to create new data, which, like for example, if you're allowing Copilot to go into all your own emails and construct an email based on a whole bunch of memos, I think you might want to look at what it constructs before you send it out, since it might have some stuff that you don't want to send to a client, right? But I'm simplifying that from a cybersecurity perspective. This becomes really important. There's ethical frameworks, and then of course there's all the education and training, and then of course all the talent. So as you can see that this new type of AI has generated a whole breadth of different members in this ecosystem that have a bunch of different skill sets that will have to evolve. So as people say their jobs are going away, there aren't people trained to do all of these jobs today. So so there are jobs that are being created. So I want to take a step back. So when I wrote this book on ESG, one of the things that was apparent is that every time you have a new industrial revolution, you do have this sort of breakage in terms of how things were done in the past, and you're obviously creating economic value because you've got a confluence of different things. You've got in the past, Jeremy Rifkin, you may want to look him up if you're interested. He's a professor at Wharton, and he talks about every industrial revolution has three forces that come on. It's usually about powering economic value differently, communicating economic value differently, and mobility, transportation. And when you have this confluence of new technologies that are evolving and this cross-pollination, then you have this surge, this economic surge of new opportunities that come. And so the fourth industrial revolution is interesting because if you listen to Kathy Wood's last TED Talk, which I highly recommend that you listen to, she says that there's 5, and she claims that 10% of the world's GDP will come from these new technologies. So if you think that there are jobs that are going away, you should think about the fact that you need people to create those new entities. So of course, each industrial revolution has had its issues. The early ones had labor, there was fossil fuels, the sharing economy was sort of disruptive, IoT. Of course, we hear a lot about carbon from a sustainability perspective, but my big one is cyber, because I, of course, work in the cyberspace, but we live in a world that's, according to the, I think it was Atlanta Fed that said 93% of business is now driven by data. And if data is at risk, today I think we just heard that there was a deep fake, was it $25 million check was sent to the wrong location. Cyber risk is the most immediate financial and material risk that exists. So everyone has their own risk. But back to the original topic, which is, does technology create more jobs than it destroys? And so on the left, everybody always hears about how, before the Industrial Revolution, everybody worked on farms. And so this chart over here kind of represents from 1871 all the people that worked on farms, and then all the people that work on farms today. And this morning for the students, I showed them how you're using now AI robotics to be able to pick fruits automatically. And of course, if you think about all the agriculture that's being done indoors, and much more water efficient. And so this chart may represent the labor, but I would actually argue that while there are less people working on farms, I would say that the quality of life for the average person is much greater than it would have been if everybody had stayed on the farms. Does everybody disagree? Anybody disagree with on that? So I actually think that technology actually has a good component. Now the chart on the right came from, I think, the Financial Times about all the jobs that are going to be destroyed, and I hear this all the time. So so I thought I'd put it out there, but as I just explained to you, that ecosystem, there's a lot of work that needs to be done to build out those ecosystem, and somebody needs to work there because it's not going to happen by itself, and AI is not going to build itself, right? So so just to sort of reiterate, because I do believe that technology creates jobs, just because historically it has. You think about, I'm not going to go through all of this, and once again, if you're interested, we'll be more than happy to give you the slides, but every one of these innovations, whether it's been the personal computer, the internet, e-commerce, digital advertising, it's like all these innovations have destroyed some jobs, but they created a whole slew of new jobs, right, that we didn't even know existed, or that we didn't even think about because we weren't living in that day. And if you look at the, so which one is this? This is the Federal Reserve in Atlanta says 92% of jobs all require digital skills. So I basically say that in the future that you probably won't have great employment unless you understand sort of the palette of all these technologies and how they work. So going from the year 2000 to today, and you think about cybersecurity, blockchain, data science, artificial intelligence. I mean, you look through history and you see that a lot of jobs have been created through the use of these technologies. So I don't think that this new set of this new wave of technology is going to be any different. I know I'm going through really quickly through these slides, and I'm happy to leave them behind. So now Goldman Sachs says that only 7 trillion of the global GDP will be fueled, which if you think about it, it's like, what is it, 100 trillion is the global GDP, so they're saying 7 trillion will be fueled by these new technologies, and Kathy Wood says 10 trillion, but it's just a rounding error at this point, just realize it's a lot, so your guess is as good as mine. So then I tried to take a guess as to the types of jobs that we think will evolve and, going forward. I mean, obviously you have all the generic technical skills that are required to build all those things that I showed you before. But then there are examples of domain expertise, because when you think about this palette of technologies that you have to understand, right? It's like, how are you going to make an impact in healthcare if you don't know healthcare? Or how are you going to make an impact in transportation? Or how are you going to make an impact in insurance or finance if you don't have an expertise in one of those? So it's this cross-pollination between a particular industry and the use of these tools to solve interesting problems, do things more efficiently. I mean, I was just having a conversation about the healthcare space, which is one of my pet peeves, because I feel like data in the healthcare space is a requirement, because if you look at the UN sustainability goals, what's the goal? It's to have healthcare for everyone. But the number of doctors that we're producing every year is declining. So how are you going to give everybody healthcare if nobody wants to be a doctor, right? So you're going to have to come up with alternatives to that, or you're going to have to enslave smart people to be doctors or do something, because and that's kind of cruel. So I think that finding ways to use the data is probably going to be an important thing. Although I did meet a few students today that want to be doctors, so we're solving that problem here locally, right? But it's important to note that the types of jobs that are going to be created still going to require a lot of education and cross-pollination between these different disciplines. So here's the talk by Kathy Woods, and I highly suggest that you watch that. I mean, I know she's a little bit controversial, but I truly believe that her talk about how all these various technologies, and I think that they're more than that, she talks about how in the past it's always been the confluence of 3 technologies that spilled these industrial revolutions, and she says that now we're talking about the confluence of even more technologies. And the people who are smart enough to sort of figure out how to cross-pollinate across these different technologies are the ones that are going to be able to create this value. It's also important to note that while there's been a lot of discussion about how the Facebooks, the Amazons and Microsofts, and how they're going to own this next generation, I'm not 100% sure, because I worked at Hearst and Disney when they were convinced they were going to own the internet. Like, you could not tell them otherwise. And they don't own the internet right now, right? Other companies popped up, they solved interesting problems, they came up with a different way of doing advertising. Who would have predicted that? No one. Well, I'll tell you, Disney and Hearst would not have, right? So I think that we have to think about careers in the future as constantly learning and having this palette of different skills that you can pull upon to be able to participate in this future. So how am I doing on time? Am I talking fast enough? I'm from New York, so I talk a lot very fast. I want to make sure that I have time for Q&A, because I was suggested that was important. So when I think about new technologies, I think about innovation, right? And innovation creates opportunity, economic opportunity. And I'm from New York, so I love to talk about the great manure crisis. So I'm sure you've all been to Manhattan, and you notice on the Upper East Side there's these stairs that the front door is always lifted from the street. And the reason is because during that era you had 100,000, 150,000 horse-drawn carriages. They were pooping all over the street and it smelled really bad, right? That was the great manure crisis. Who talks about that now, right? So then, of course, cars came around and that whole crisis went poof away and nobody ever talks about it again, as almost it didn't exist, right? So I do think that technologies evolve, and while they're, you have this carbon crisis now, people don't really, they move on and they solve new problems with these technologies. But this one's my favorite. Not that I do a lot of housework, but but the evolution of home appliances freed women from their homes. And so prior, like in the 1900s, only 5% of women worked outside of the home. And then once they had all these appliances, they had the freedom to go out and work. And so the number in the 1950s was 51% of women, married women, would work outside of the home because they didn't have to sit at home and do laundry by hand and all these home functions. This is just my favorite because, anyway, not that I would have been home doing any of that stuff, but I just think that it's a wonderful story. And then, of course, we know what happened with smartphones. I mean, our kids have, they grew up with these devices, and so, like this morning we were talking about how you can do translation and hold your phone up to a sign and automatically be able to read a sign in a complete different language, and all these AI-enabled things are just on the palm of their phone. But what I'd also like to point out is the fact that when companies don't innovate, they go out of business. And there's some statistic that people talk about how long the top companies actually stay in the S&P and the top Fortune 500 companies. If they're not innovating, they don't stay there. They just don't, right? So we have to ask our kids to be constantly learning, and the organizations they're going to work with are going to have to do the same thing. And once again, develop this palette of understanding, understand the texture, how things work together, and just remain curious in order to make sure that they remain relevant and they don't end up like Kodak and Polaroid. And whenever I say this, people say, well, they're not out of business. I'm like, okay, well, they're not the same as they were before, so whatever. So as a conclusion, I think it's important to note that AI has the potential to cross-pollinate and be able to solve a lot of interesting problems and be able to do a lot of interesting things that will generate economic value, but you just have to understand what that palette looks like, how it works together. And keep in mind that palette is going to keep changing, so you have to keep learning and keeping abreast of that technology. I also think from a regulatory perspective, people want to have a better understanding of what's going on with this AI, what data that they used, what types of transformers and large language models. So this whole accountability, which I think the private models today already have that level of transparency, because the Watson X IBMs and these big companies are already embedding that into the private models that they're building. And so anyway, in terms of data, there's statistics from IDC that 90% of the data that will be created in the next 5 years will be completely unstructured. So at the beginning of the talk, I sort of explained that this transitional moment is that artificial intelligence today doesn't need a human saying, okay, this is a bottle, learn and look at it, and I can pour stuff out of it. It's like it can learn about all that associated information somewhat automatically, which is what makes this somewhat magical as a capability. And the fact that we're going to have over 165 zettabytes, don't ask me how many zero that is because I forgot. But you look at all the data you're going to have, it's going to be unstructured. So you need AI to make sense of that data and then be able to use it. So whether it be healthcare data or company data. So this technology is not going away anytime soon. I don't care what the people in Italy say, because not everything is a public large language models stealing stuff from the New York Times. There's smaller versions that are doing very important work. And as I said, 7 trillion of the GDP is going to be generated from these generative AI technologies. And as I said, 92% of all the jobs, according to the Federal Reserve of Atlanta, require digital skills. So with that, I open it up for questions, and I wowed you all that nobody has their hand raised.